You need to ditch your silly fantasy, science fiction, or supernatural novel and step into the arena with the big boys and start writing historical fiction. Because when I look at a lot of the literary greats, their work was steeped in history. And Don DeLillo agrees with me and says, that quote, my own personal preference is for fiction that is steeped in history, that takes account of ways in which our perceptions are being changed by the events around us, global events that may alter how we live in the smallest ways. Because many of my OGs out there, many of you guys are artists and are connected to the world around us. And we can very easily sit down and look at the causal factors that led us to where we are right now. But if we project ourselves into the future, it turns into speculation. And that's why it's called speculative fiction. And many people try to overcome the barrier of speculation by diving into complete fantasy or science fiction. But there is an inherent problem with that because, for instance, if we look at Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon was a genius writer at the time, but he had the ability to look back at the rise of corporations and the military-industrial complex and intelligence agencies that all kind of grew in the zone and beyond the zero, and write one of the best novels of all time. But what most fantasy and science fiction writers don't realize is that if you are going to step into the game of trying to write something transformative in science fiction or fantasy, then you are competing with Frank Herbert. This is the standard because if you look at Dune, it took Herbert over 6 books to talk and transform the reader. And how did he do it? I'm not going to spoil anything here, but if you look at the 4th book of the Dune series, it is a reflection of the tens of thousands of years and the world building that he built in the first 3 novels. Throughout the entire novel, characters are reflecting on history, on the Bible, on Hitler, on these certain characters and using them as anchors. And at some level, because Frank Herbert was attuned to Carl Jung and archetypes and Joseph Campbell and politics, Dune really is a historical novel that is kind of cloaked in the veil of a science fiction novel. And all of us believe that we can do it. All of us believe that we are the one. But I know that most of the fantasy and science fiction authors that I know who get into it secretly love it, because if I build an entire fantasy or science fiction world, no one could tell me that I am wrong. I currently run a creative writing club, and one of my students at my high school is writing this sprawling fantasy novel. And when I tell him, hey, I don't think this makes sense or what's wrong here, he can tell me that I'm wrong because he's created all of it. But if you look at something like a Gravity's Rainbow or William T. Vollmann's Europe Central, there are so many sharks in the water in terms of World War II history. You are probably one of them. We all have our opinions and have read books and listened to podcasts. And so if you are going to write a World War II novel, then you are going to have to hold yourself to a certain standard to appease, first and foremost, all the nerds out there. And this is why William T. Vollmann, in his novel Europe Central, which I think is the greatest World War II novel of all time, is so magnificent because he one-ups all the World War II nerds. Anyone who thinks they know about World War II just got smacked by Vollmann, and then he artistically writes about World War II better than anyone too. And so you're sitting there and you're like, damn, what an accomplishment. Out of anyone who's ever written about the greatest conflict of all time, he just did it the best. But that makes it more relatable. That makes it more understandable. And so when you look at a novel, so let's say I was going to write a novel about 2 people in 2024 and their love life and how, poverty has affected them. All of us can relate to that. But unconsciously, our minds, while reading literature, love to kind of move through these storylines and historical events and causal factors, and we like to be shocked or affirmed with what is happening. And that's what makes historical novels so good. But a historical novel makes it seem like you are writing about the Napoleonic era or Sola or something like that. But if you look at Cormac McCarthy's The Border Trilogy, they are historical novels. They are set in, the 1940s and early 1950s. And here's a writing tip for everyone. McCarthy finds a desire that is still present today and has always existed in our minds, and that is for freedom and adventure. If you look at all the van lifers and all the people out there who are quitting their jobs and going to explore the world, they are no different than John Grady Cole or Billy Parham and that same and that energy. And so McCarthy takes it back to an iconic era, the era where the ranches in Texas and other places are dying and being barbed wired and basically being closed off forever, and exposes us to two idealistic characters who want to break free of that. And it's steeped in tragedy, and he makes it a very hard and terrible reality for them, but it's steeped in something real. And why do you guys think that Yellowstone and the whole kind of Taylor Sheridan catalog is so popular right now? Because people are into that. And McCarthy recognized that in 1992 because he was in tune with himself. And so the further you get away from yourself by creating different worlds and different beings, and like I said, that's okay, the less likely it is you're going to write something transformative. And so a secret thing that happens too is that so right now I am writing a novel that is set in like the early 1900s in Tucson. How many of you guys know the history of Tucson in the 1900s? Not many. And with the detail, I'm going to write about Tucson, stemming from my historical research. Someone reading it is going to be like, oh, this is how Tucson was like in the early 1900s. But that false belief is also the power of historical fiction, that if you go back in time and do something that isn't as popular as World War II, then you become the authority. It is your story, his story. You get to become the one who tells the narrative. And if you guys understand how powerful that is, that's insane, because in a science fiction novel, I get to create my own world and control and own the narrative in that world. But through the power of historical fiction, you will get to own a piece of history, especially if that novel is successful. My perception of Chihuahua and Sonora and New Mexico and Texas in the 1940s and 50s will be forever shaped by Cormac McCarthy, even though he wasn't there during that time. And so obviously you can't change what you are going to write about. If you are already writing a novel, I'm not telling you to switch. And if your next novel idea is taking place in the future or the present day, it's not that big of a deal. But once again, I ask and implore you guys to start programming yourself with the idea that your purpose here as an author in the literary renaissance is to transform others, not just to put art out into the ether. We already have enough of that. And when you sit down and really think about how hard it is to, first of all, make people care and then have them believe in you and your story enough to change their own life, it is next to impossible. And you need every single chip in your favor if you want to be able to accomplish that. I'm just like all of you guys. I have a sci-fi Western idea in my head that's been in there for a decade. And at some point, I'm going to write it just for shits and giggles. But that's after I've changed millions of people's lives and awakened them to something better. Because transforming is much bigger than just contemplation. And this is where I think a lot of people get mixed up. They're like, yo, in my novel, there's a commentary on people being exploited by the government and on love. But that's almost every single piece of art. What actionable or specific thing are people going to take with them into the future? And as I always talk about on this program, I think that a lot of people resist, especially people who double down in genre fiction, because I don't care if you're going to do genre fiction, but there is a certain archetype of an individual, just like there is a certain archetype of an individual that wants to write avant-garde fiction and not care about transforming people, but just being the most experimental person. And those people and the people who double down and only do genre are doing a disservice to their own artistic potential and current readers and future readers and authors who could be inspired by them. And so I've noticed the genre fiction crowd refuses to write transformative works and refuses to take that seriously because they have not done that in their own life yet. And I hate to use generalizations and call people nerds because we're all nerds. But to clear up that term, I'm referencing people who live in the lore, who live in fantasy, who are fantasy addicts and can build these worlds and do these things, but they've forgotten about this world. Most of the greats in fantasy and science fiction weren't like that. There are outlier exceptions. But Gene Wolfe was a real human being. Tolkien was a real human being. Frank Herbert worked jobs and was a real human being. And being a real human being doesn't mean having a job and having a wife, but actually living an experienced life, like taking risks and doing things and traveling the world. And I'd like to ask you guys right now, what is the level, I guess I should say, of guarantee that the average group of readers should have for transformation if they look at your work? I think that if you read Infinite Jest seriously by David Foster Wallace and don't give up and you get through the entire 1,000-page novel, you will have a much different view on addiction and people you know who are addicts and familial trauma. And some people don't experience that. But I would say easily a quarter, if not half of the people who actually get through the book and comprehend the book have their minds opened on those topics. And David Foster Wallace didn't have to go around and say or be too explicit that that's what he was trying to do. But he was experiencing that as a recovering addict and wanted to bring that idea and that power to more people. And so if someone picked up one of your novels right now, or 100 people did, would there be a consensus agreement of at least 25% of the people who had their lives changed in a specific way? Because, things also get murky because people go, art isn't like this not art. But we get a lot of these cliches and axioms from like visual art, because yes, if I go and look at a painting, most of the time I don't have my life transformed. Maybe if I spend an afternoon at an art museum, I'm opened up to a wide possibility of experience. But just looking at one painting for, even 5 minutes doesn't have the same potential to change my life as a novel would. And the same goes with television. I've had my life changed by certain movies, and I'm sure you have too, but it's very rare. And because of the lack of interiority in movies and their lack of length, it's become really hard. And even, and there's been a couple TV shows, and this is why people talk about the golden age of cinema. I will never look at city dynamics and drug dealing again, the same way again because of The Wire. I will never view villains the same way necessarily after I've seen The Sopranos. There are exceptions and ideas that can happen over the course of 80 hours of a television show. But once again, in comparison to what 80 hours of reading something with the same ideas could do, that's insane. If you spent 80 hours reading about, some of the dynamics that are in play in The Wire or the psychological dynamics of The Sopranos, we're talking about you reading 3,000 plus pages, if not more, and if it's 300 pages a book, what would be more effective? The top 10 books on psychology and psychoanalytic thought of all time, or watching The Sopranos? So this is to say that a lot of the other ideas and a lot of the other avant-garde ideas or campy ideas that other art forms have don't necessarily apply to writing, even though we really want them to and really force them on our audience. And so I'm imploring you, if you've been contemplating writing a historical novel, especially one that's taking place in the last 100 years, even if it's something that's about the Vietnam War or something that's only 30 or 40 years old, please do it. It will be more effective than probably any of your other ideas, And so, boom, there we have it. I love each and every one of you guys. Thank you guys for all the support, and I will see you guys in the next video that is dropping later tonight.